Thank you for joining me on this webinar on conservation drainage, a case study. I am Keegan Colt, the Executive Director with the Agricultural Drainage Management Coalition. This is the sixth webinar of the webinar series brought to you by CTIC, the Conservation Technology Information Center, through a grant they had with EPA to help train ag consultants. This grant was really aimed at providing resources to CCAs and different ag consultants on being able to advise on the benefits of conservation drainage practices. So today we're going to focus on one of the most successful case studies on getting these practices out there in the landscape. Stepping back a little bit about ADMC. ADMC is an industry-led coalition. Members are the tile manufacturers and distributors, the engineers, the software companies that support them, others in the ag industry, commodity organizations, the land improvement contractors associations, and the contractors themselves. ADMC's mission is really to focus on finding practical solutions to manage our drainage systems to provide both improvements in our production and agronomics and environmental outcomes. In this module, you will learn about the historic implementation of conservation drainage practices, what outreach methods are most effective, a new framework that can be utilized to scale adoption, and then finally, how to utilize a fiscal agent. The case study we're going to learn about today is referred to as a Polk County project, Polk County Saturated Buffer Project. And I would be remiss if I didn't recognize all those involved with this project that were on the leadership team. So really our Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, Polk County itself was very instrumental on managing this project, the Polk Soil and Water Conservation District, and then finally the NRCS, along with ADMC. So the Polk County model, why was it one of the most successful case studies in scaling conservation drainage practice adoption? Well, in 2021, the project was able to install 40 saturated buffers and 11 bioreactors. A little historical context, there's only 49 of these practices installed nationwide utilizing EQIP from 2016 through 2020. Our method, this Polk County model, estimated to save about $115,000 compared to traditional practice delivery methods. It was really successful because we utilized a fiscal agent model. And then finally, this model is meant to be repeatable, and actually we're looking to install about 80 sites in 2022, and in Polk County alone, there's now 102 sites that have been installed. So another 51 sites went in 2022, and there's going to be about 30 sites going in the neighboring Story County in Iowa. And actually across the state of Iowa, there's going to be about 4 to 5 more of these batch and builds occurring on any given year. So we'll start seeing implementation rates from 50 to 80 to a couple hundred of these practices a year in the foreseeable future. So just looking at the historical context of these practices, they're really good practices. We know that they work. We know you saw in the earlier webinars, very effective, cost efficient at removing nitrogen from the system. However, we've been very slow to deliver them. And I think it's because our practice delivery methods need to be a little bit different compared to traditional cultural, in-field practices where we see that benefit to the producer for maintaining and improving that soil resource. There's really no benefit to the producer. It's all downstream benefits with some of these conservation drainage practices. And so tweaking the way we get these practices out is very important moving into the future. Here are a few slides that NRCS shares with us at our Conservation Drainage Network annual meetings, looking at the historical implementation rate utilizing EQIP. And EQIP is the biggest cost share program out there, financial assistance program out there through the NRCS. And so it's very important to be able to utilize EQIP. And this slide isn't meant to say the NRCS isn't doing its job. It's just showing that perhaps our traditional methods of delivering conservation won't always work when it comes to conservation drainage. So with bioreactors, there were 35 bioreactors installed nationwide. Over this 5-year span, there's 14 saturated buffers installed nationwide. I made a joke with my friends at the Soil Water Conservation Society at their annual meeting in 2020 that engineers, unfortunately, are very literal people, and these are engineered practices we work with. And so, the swag that they hand out of stopping hypoxia, one BMP at a time, we're taking a little too seriously, and that seems like what we were actually doing before we came up with this Polk County saturated buffer project. So historically in Polk County, what was being done to treat tile outlets? You're utilizing a mix of different funding sources. So in Iowa, there's the Water Quality Initiative funding, and that is a state funding pool. And then there's the traditional NRCS EQIP funding through federal NRCS programs, and then through FSA programs, the CRP program and CLEAR initiative can fund these practices. That traditional cost share model was really, we did the whole 9-step conservation planning method, and it was opportunity based, farmers coming forward to the office asking for this. And the result of that was about 6 outlets treated from 2015 to 2019, which actually, if you look at implementation rates, right, there's only 50 of these nationwide, 6 outlets over a 5-year span in one county isn't doing too poorly. But one of the newly elected commissioners was looking at the watershed plans, and these watershed plans were calling for upwards of 100 of these practices to be installed, and really installing 1 or 2 of these at a time just wasn't a reasonable solution. So that commissioner started meeting with leaders in the drainage community about what could be done to speed up implementation. So, sitting down with Polk Soil Water Conservation District and then the county, Polk County itself, and they had a former Polk Soil Water Conservation District employee shipped over to the county to manage their watershed programs. An ADMC, we got together and we sat down and really identified the barriers to adoption that we thought was going on in this watershed. That first one was outlets often get lost in the conversation around other practices. So, we kind of have the Cheesecake Factory menu of conservation practices available to farmers. And if you go out and meet with a farmer and talk about this long list of practices that they could install, they get a little glossy-eyed by the time you get down to talking about saturated buffers, especially when you're thinking about downstream benefits of these practices. Next, even if we have a really good cost share program set up for this, that hassle factor to the landowner was still too much to work with, thinking about hiring and managing the contractor themselves, come into the office multiple times to sign paperwork for it. That hassle factor was still too much for them to want to take on the project versus what we're thinking about doing with the Polk County model. Working within the CRP program was a little complicated, trying to update their conservation plans to actually allow us to do these practices in a CRP filter strip. And then, if all that actually went well, we got the paperwork done, we had the landowner interested, we had a project designed. Sometimes it's still hard to find a contractor willing to take time off their busy schedule and do the installation. And so we'd be further delayed waiting for the contractor to be able to actually install the practice. This is really because, installing these practices 1 or 2 at a time are not a moneymaker for our contractors. And so it came as an opportunity cost for that contractor to do the job. And finally, there's also tax issues for the landowner by receiving that, payment for the conservation practice that can be taxable. And so trying to figure out ways to deal with all these, we developed this framework. And this framework really had 6 different steps in it. We wanted to prioritize watersheds that had this agricultural conservation planning framework ran in it, and the ACPF is able to identify saturated buffer and bioreactor sites. So we wanted to pick watersheds in the county that had a high occurrence of likely saturated buffer and bioreactor sites to begin with. Next, we wanted to focus on recruitment, and we wanted to be very direct with landowners and actually have a one-on-one contact with each landowner. Don't be passive with the recruitment. We wanted to create demand. Originally, we wanted to put 25 sites in. Um, we thought that was a crucial number to start gaining some efficiencies of scale, where we could maybe get cheaper rates from our contractors. We'd actually get contractors interested in installing the practice, and then also more efficient on the design side of things. We just really wanted to hit that threshold, and we thought we would actually come out ahead in the long run if we were able to do that. To do that, we wanted to create demand for it, so we actually had an incentive payment for participating, and this incentive payment came through in the form of a temporary construction easement to kind of get landowners over the hump to agree to participate with the project. With that, we also wanted to recruit landowners to treat every suitable outlet. So it's more efficient just to go to a field once instead of coming back year after year to install these practices. Nothing's worse than having a field day, putting in a saturated buffer or a bioreactor, and then ultimately you'll have a farmer walk up to the stream and point out that they could see 4 more outlets in the stream. What are we doing about those? And so, that farmer's right. We should be doing something on every outlet that would work for the practice. We know these practices work, and they're very cost effective. So we might as well, if we have the landowner and the farmer interested in installing, let's take a look at all of their sites that they have available. And if they work, let's go ahead and do the installation. I'm limiting that hassle factor for the landowner. Once again, that's kind of what gets them over the top. They don't have to manage the contractor themselves. They're very aware of the timeline with this model of, it is going to be about a year-long process of it. We're going to do the survey, the design work ourselves, and then hiring the contractor so they don't have to work with it. And then utilizing a fiscal agent model, which it's been used before, even used in conservation, but it's not used enough. The fiscal agent model allowed us to bundle multiple sites together and create bid packages. And these bid packages, took the management of the contractor out of the hands of the landowner and put it into the hands of the fiscal agent. Looking at our outreach method, we sat down and took a look at all the farmers and landowners that had an occurrence of an ACPF identified saturated buffer site within these watersheds, and we sent them a mailer. The mailer included just a one-page flyer describing what the project is, what was in it for the landowner. Very basic about what a saturated buffer does. We didn't want to overwhelm them with too much information. We also included a map of the field that we were talking about, so that way they would have that map when they received a phone call. Then they received a form letter. We spent some time deliberating who should be the letterhead on that. We ultimately chose the Polk Soil Water Conservation District because that local conservation district had a good relationship with farmers in the county. Maybe that's something to think about when people are replicating this, of the project partners, who has probably that best relationship in that area, and put that on the letterhead. That letter said we did include this map, tell them the field that we were going to talk about. Then we also had a lead project staff listed, and moving out with, thinking about our conservation agronomists that we're working with, and so CCAs, we're hoping that are watching these webinars. I think this really is a spot, an opportunity for CCAs to become involved and be part of that outreach method. Even if the CCAs aren't going to be doing any of the survey work themselves, so that gets handed over to the watershed coordinator. But if they could help make that connection to the farmers, I think that's very valuable. We actually sat down and list all the landowners and identified who would be the best lead for them. So if that watershed coordinator already had an existing relationship with the landowner, because they've done some other practice with them in the past, that watershed coordinator is obviously going to make that phone call. In our situation, we have Heartland Co-op has a group of conservation agronomists. And so if it's a Heartland Co-op customer, they're going to be making that first phone call. And finally, in this situation, if it would be a complete cold call, there's no prior relationship with that landowner or farmer, I would be reaching out to them myself. We actually batched these letters out very intentionally. we listed that, in a few days to a week, the lead project staff would be making contact with you. And we found that was actually very, very beneficial to do because the letter was fresh in people's minds. Um, not everybody read the letter, but they remember seeing that they got a letter, and actually it kind of worked well. If they got the letter and didn't read it, they felt a little guilty, and so Iowa Nights, they would actually be a little bit more willing to talk with you because they felt bad that they didn't read. But also it really showed the landowners that we're committed to this process by following through within that few days to week window of making that phone call. They knew that we were serious about this project, and they found it interesting and worthwhile. That first phone call, our only goal was to gain permission to survey and see if that outlet was actually suitable for the practice or not. And we found that most of the landowners that we spoke to were willing to let us go out there and do that initial survey. So successful outreach, how it started there on that left picture, we felt very good. We thought we were super organized and had this methodical method of identifying who's going to be calling these landowners, which ones had the priority sites, even identifying some of the bigger landowners in the watershed to know like this person has a lot of potential sites. We need to make sure we get a hold of them. To how it went, it wasn't always easy. We show this picture just because you have to have a little resilience to these projects. These case studies always look so nice and shiny at the end, but really, it's never a straight linear path to success. You have uphills and downhills. These are all the returned letters that we had the wrong addresses, and we got the addresses actually from the NRCS files. And so we were able to update quite a few files for the NRCS with the right addresses. So we had to do some more work to try to find and get a hold of these landowners. So I mentioned earlier that we were really that initial outreach, we were just looking for that connection with the landowner to get permission to go out there and complete the survey. We had overwhelming success doing that direct outreach method. I kind of joke about when I make presentations that sometimes we do death by field day where we have a new project, we get some funding in place, we spend a year trying to find a demo site, and then we have that installation. We invite all the people in the watershed, come watch the installation, and we hope that that spurs adoption within the watershed. But we've all been to those field days before where the same 5 landowners that show up to every field day shows up, and then we have 15 agency and project staff at the field day trying to sell. And we really don't deliver that much conservation just based on those field days. So we really didn't want to do any field days with this until after we had kind of our success. So getting back to surveying, overwhelming success with this direct outreach model. Between the 2 years, 2020 and 2021, we were able to survey about 330 outlets. This really pushed us to standardize the process and make it more efficient. We first started off with a marker board to keep track of landowners and sites, the simple Excel spreadsheet. Then all of a sudden we keep adding columns and more columns. And so getting a good database management system was very important. Also, we had to be more efficient and effective with your time out there. So one trip to the site, get all the information that designer is going to need. We estimate we spend about 1 hour per outlet on this. If you're setting up a batch and build program to replicate this Polk County model, it's very important to know who's going to be doing the designs of the practices. Is it going to be the NRCS? Is it going to be a private consultant? But you need to know the design preferences and requirements from them before you go out and do the survey work to make sure you have all that information and you don't have to make repeat trips back out to that site. Also, while you're out there, it's very important to make note of any other issues that landowner might have. There could be a blown tile, a failing outlet, or anything else. Maybe the waterway needs a little work. There's some gullies starting to form on the edge. It's a good opportunity to relay that information and feedback to the landowner. And finally, when you're setting these projects up, you got to think about when to do your outreach so you can actually do your surveying April through June, at least in the Midwest. It's very important to be able to survey at this time. As you get further into the summer, it's really difficult to see with the vegetation growth where these outlets are. You're going to miss outlets and opportunities for treatment that way. and it's pretty miserable being out there when it's 95 degrees and you're walking through chest high grass with your chest waders on at the same time. So being able to do these surveys April through June is very important. If you know where all the outlets are, winter actually isn't too bad of a time a year to do it, as long as the outlets aren't covered in snow and you're able to get out there. You can do some pretty quick surveying in the winter months as well. Surveying, never do it in August. We can have the lead team going out. That we could catch a few more fields and do some surveys in August. We realized if you could make it out here in this picture, you can see the spool of our Maverick that we use to actually do the survey work. So the Maverick is, you basically feed that up the tile line and it transmits a signal that you can sense the depth of the tile with. It turns out we weren't on an outlet, we were on a side inlet to drain kind of the berm behind this drainage ditch. And so we were feeding it up there and then go back up into the field to go do our locate. And we see that all of our spool of Maverick was in the soybean field at the time. So it is very important to try to get those surveys done by June at the latest. I'm looking at this fiscal agent model. So this is kind of conventional financial assistance for these conservation drainage practices. A lot of time, once again, 100% benefits to downstream users. So we try to find as much cost share available as possible. A lot of times you can mix and match from different programs and make the farmer or landowner whole, so they're not paying anything out of pocket ultimately. But this is what it looks like. For that top row, the golden boxes there are the different funding agencies. So the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, the Farm Services Agency, and PC's Polk County. A lot of times when you have projects to install these practices, it'll look something like this, where you'll have a mix of different funding sources that you can kind of blend together to get to 100%. The blue boxes are the different landowners that you're working with. Then across the bottom is the contractors that those landowners might have. So a landowner, to get those different financial assistance, they would have to have agreements with every single one of those funding agencies in place. And then the landowner also has to go out and have an agreement or contract with the contractor. Typically what happens then is the contractor does the work, they invoice the landowner pays the contractor, and then the landowner shows that they paid the contractor to their different funding agencies. And so then they have to apply for reimbursement. And so they have to invoice those funding agencies and they get payment back. Well, this works if you're doing maybe one or two at a time, but when you're doing 50, it becomes a nightmare. A lot of times the watershed coordinators kind of playing the middle ground in this, making sure all those invoices are coming in and out. So obviously you're not going to be able to manage that once you're scaling up to get to these high number of sites. Also, presents a significant barrier to landowners for installing multiple practices. They might dip their toe, and front the cost for like one or two saturated buffers that cost about $5,000 a piece. But if you're talking about treating, working with a farmer that has 3,000 acres and all of a sudden they have 20 outlets, they're probably not going to want to write that check to the contractor at that time. And the contractor also doesn't want to be taking on that risk of waiting on payment to the landowner. So we came up with the fiscal agent model, where actually we have a third party. In this case, it was Polk County itself was the fiscal agent. They had agreements with all the funding agencies. Also had an agreement with the landowner through a temporary construction easement to gain the right to manage a public agency contractor on their private lands. And that's how that incentive payment came to be. The fiscal agent then created a bid package with all these different landowner sites together. And then they put it out to public bid. Contractor is awarded the bid and works directly with that fiscal agent to do the installation. The fiscal agent oversees the contractor. It was nice in this situation. The contractor was able to invoice back to the fiscal agent every 2 weeks during the installs. And so they were never out too much of a cost, and they were able to receive payment instead of having to wait until after all 50 of the sites were installed. Fiscal agent makes a lot of sense. This really is a public infrastructure project since we are doing downstream improvements on private land. Partner funding is all assigned to that one entity. Makes it work a lot smoother that way once we get those agreements in place. And then it follows that public bidding process. So if we hit bid thresholds for amount of time and the notice that's sent out, those are all followed. And really fiscal agents have experience with the bid process. Since we did utilize the county, they're used to following that, so they already had language in place on how to do this. It did allow us to do that temporary construction easement, which allowed us to have that incentive payment to the landowners for that easement. And then we still have a 10-year maintenance agreement with this, and actually the fiscal agent doesn't hold that maintenance agreement. In this situation, we utilize the Soil Water Conservation District to hold that maintenance agreement, since the districts do that for most conservation practices already. It makes a lot of sense to do that. One different thing, we did have the maintenance agreement signed up front. Typically, that maintenance agreement gets signed after the practice is in place and on the ground. But since we were putting these together in a bid package, we couldn't risk landowners backing out after that bid had gone out, because that would change how that bid looked to that contractor, and maybe that contractor wouldn't have wanted to do that project if we lost too many sites. So we did have the landowner sign a maintenance agreement before the practice was installed, and then the funding never goes directly to the landowner. The results of this particular case study, this batch and build Polk County Saturated Buffer Project 2021, there's 51 sites that went in. 2022, there's an additional 85, so 51 of those were installed in Polk County, and then the other 30 were in the neighboring Story County. Then statewide, in the state of Iowa, just for some context, from 2010 through 2021, there was 147 of these practices installed. So you can see we're really starting to ramp up that pace of implementation and starting to see this be scalable. In the future, there's going to be 4 to 5 of these batch and builds going on in the state of Iowa. ADMC is looking to expand the use of these batch and build projects outside the state of Iowa. Anywhere where there's significant state funding, I think it makes it a lot easier. So states like Minnesota, Ohio, and Missouri have very attractive state funding that can do this. Same way with areas of Chesapeake also has great potential to do this. Otherwise, if there's good partnerships in place that can find funding to help implement this, I think we'll see these batch and builds start happening there. Indiana, Illinois, I think also will be very well suited for the batch and build. Just looking at the coverage of what does it look like once we start getting 50 of these sites out. Here's a stretch of 4 Mile Creek in Polk County. Every green dot there represents a saturated buffer. Some of those we had to tie outlets together to warrant treatment. They might have been smaller drainage areas, but if we could tie 2 to 3 outlets together instead of being a 10-acre drainage area, also we had that 30 to 40 acres coming into it. It made it worthwhile. The red dots are bioreactors. So you can see we had a handful of bioreactors get installed through this. The blue diamonds are really just access points for the contractor for the bid document. And if it was blue, it meant they could get in there year round to do the work. They wouldn't be driving over a crop to do so. If it's orange, it generally meant the crops had to be out. Looking at traditional expenses, about $6,000 for a saturated buffer, 15 for bioreactors, but really the biggest expense or one that we could have the most impact in is the engineering cost to do these designs. It's very expensive. These are practices that require a PE stamp, and so a professional engineer has to do that. IDOLS was paying about $5,700 per saturated buffer and almost $6,000 per bioreactor design. Getting private engineers to do one at a time is very costly, but if you can hand them the survey information for 20 sites, all of a sudden that becomes much more cost effective for them to do so. So we were able to save quite a bit on the engineering cost. So even with our temporary construction easement payment of $1,000 per outlet, we were able to bring that engineering cost down so significantly. It was about $3,000 per site on the engineering side. That we estimate we saved about $115,000 overall. Our installation costs or our contractor costs was a little bit less expensive. We didn't save a whole lot there, but we did save about $20,000 on the contractor through less mobilization fees. But I really think this makes sense because before it wasn't cost effective for the contractor to do this. They really couldn't bring their costs down a whole lot, and they weren't overcharging to do this necessarily on the front in the traditional practice delivery model. But we are saving a lot on the engineering and a lot of the behind the scene side of things. I think even we could start incorporating watershed coordinators time or this is 10 years worth of installs happening in 1 year, right? Maybe even 15 years of installs happening in 1 year. So now that watershed coordinator can focus efforts on different practices in that watershed. We always ask, should landowners be required to pay? I think landowners are signing up for, that 10-year maintenance agreement. They're agreeing to manage and actively oversee that project site. So they do have skin in the game. They do have some responsibility with this project. And so requiring them to pay, that's always a good question. Looking at our kind of traditional cost share, the 75 to 25% ratio. Actually, there will be more public expenses doing it that way because those engineering costs that the public pays for are still so much greater doing it that one at a time method. If it was a 50 to 50 cost share method, there would have been less public dollars going towards this than what we did in the Polk County project. But once again, the likelihood of installing 50 sites, doing a 50-50 cost share model, or even now 102 sites in Polk County in about a 3-year span, that obviously was never going to happen. So we think this model has a lot of validity and should be replicated moving forward. Like anything, there's always room for improvement. We need to, maybe reduce the number of outlets surveyed, being able to target areas that might be of higher resource concern than others would be very beneficial. Right now, ACPF just identified where the practice would work. It really doesn't target. There's always a question, what do you do with larger mains, the saturated buffers, in bioreactors? We can maybe sneak up to get up to 150 acres coming in, but anything larger than that, the practice really isn't well suited. And then you should start talking about some water quality wetlands, but also in those larger mains, I think there's opportunity to come back in year 2 or 3 of a project, go up in the watershed, tile shed, and see if we can implement drainage water management or inline bioreactors with those landowners that don't have an outlet to the stream. Improving the database management is very crucial. There's a lot of steps going on, and being able to access that and figure out where everybody is very important. It's a little bit different than what we're used to working with on the conservation side of things, of kind of one practice at a time with a landowner. Getting designs into the bid book is also, there's a lot of room for error on being able to work with that CAD program, maybe to identify, when we're putting that information into the bid book, it's itemized as 6-inch tile. So with 40 saturated buffers, there's a lot of distribution line for each of the different 40 saturated buffers, but all gets entered in as one, entry as 10,000 feet of 6-inch tile for that distribution line. But then there's could be errors made there where you're going through all these individual site plans and you miss a control structure here or there, and that really throws things off. We needed to engage more contractors. We're very fortunate to have a phenomenal contractor work on the Polk County project. He actually got both the bids both years, and this did an amazing job actually going out there and doing the work, but expanding the use of this. So we're doing more than just 1 or 2 of these at a time in this state. You're going to need more contractors involved, get them up to speed. So bringing contractors in early on, maybe even as the project's getting kicked off, to let them know, hey, this is going to be going on. Do you want to be involved? Do you want to receive this bid? Will you be able to work into your workload? I think is very important. Then once again, be able to prioritize those targeted areas. That's important because, with this model, we can be more selective with sites. A lot of times before we're almost begging people to install these types of practices. So we would take what we could get. But now with this, where it's attractive to farmers and landowners, we can start doing a better job prioritizing and maybe going after those higher impact areas, and that'll make everything much more cost effective in the long run. Major takeaways, same as my summary here. Once again, here's a QR code you could scan to assess your understanding of this conservation drainage case study. While you're scanning that, to summarize, this direct outreach model works very well. Being active instead of passive with outreach is very effective. It takes a little while to get people to want to make cold calls, But really it works very well, and the amount of sites that you get, it's worth the effort. Coordination between all the parties involved, between the designer and the survey crew is crucial. Not only the information that the designer needs, but the timing of when everything has to happen. So the designer might likely have other projects they're going to be working on, so they have windows where they need that information by. The survey crew has to be able to deliver on that information by those windows. Otherwise, it really slows the process down. Also, we found that this project was big enough to make people want to make it work, which was very exciting. Uh, we did run into a lot of roadblocks, but when you have 50 sites kind of hanging in the balance, people want to find a solution to it. If it's just one or two sites and you run into a roadblock, that might slip through the cracks, and people are willing to overlook that and maybe let those sites fail. But when it's 50 sites, people are a lot more motivated to find solutions. And that mindset of treating every suitable outlet instead of just doing one or two at a time, is just so much more effective. You don't have to come back out to that same field 3 years in a row. You're not asking that landowner to come into the office for 5 straight years so you can work on all their fields. They can focus on other things after they can kind of cross, you know, outlet treatment practices off their to-do list. And then finally, the landowners and contractors seem to be very happy with working with this process compared to the traditional models. We'd love it if you continue to interact with ADMC. Feel free to reach out to me via email. Follow us on Twitter. You can always become a member of ADMC. We appreciate that support always. If you visit our website, there will be a pop-up just once a year just asking you to sign up for our Conservation Drainage Weekly newsletter. I think it's a great resource where we talk about the latest research with these practices, also implementation efforts, new funding sources, projects, RCPPs, anything else, funded by NRCS. We like to publish those. Also, we publish all the field events that are going to be happening that we come across, and other webinars where researchers talk about the merits of these practices. That really keeps you in the know. If you want to learn more, it's a great resource. Finally, thank you for completing this webinar series with CTIC and ADMC, and thank you to the EPA for the grant. We do think this provide a great set of resources for our ag consultants out there.